Thanks, Chair, and apologies, Minister,
Sorry, Deputy.
that I missed your opening. We've been at a Justice Committee all afternoon that has just finished up, so I wasn't here for the opening comments. But I do think that it's a bit of an affront, really, to be calling this emergency legislation. It's an insult to people when we look at the real emergencies that exist in Irish society: the mental health crisis, the housing crisis, the bed crisis in our hospitals, and so many other crises where there's no emergency response, where there's no immediate action or no solutions put in place. Where are the sweeping powers to deal with that? And I think 7 years after its introduction, and 3 years after Fine Gael ministers started to claim that the crisis was over, that everything is grand, that you're still relying on emergency powers to implement this portfolio is, to be honest, very, very shocking. The Minister and the Government are trying to create a scenario, really, that would have us believe that we're always on the brink. We're always balanced on the edge, forever in the need of having undemocratic, drastic measures. Although you've obviously said, of course, we're beginning a process where we're going to exit FEMPI. A lot of people are very doubtful about that. And the reason why they legitimately can be is that the reality is proving that the intention is not really there for that. And in actual fact, what FEMPI has been a cover to bring in structural reforms in the Irish economy, to undermine public services, undermine workers' pay, to facilitate a race to the bottom that many in society are paying a price for. The actual emergency in this state, as in the Emergency Powers Act of 1939, was in place for 7 years during a real emergency, World War II. And now we've had FEMPI in place for 7 years when there's no emergency in this regard. And, you know, it is a step that's been taken, we should say, also at the expense of the democratic process, because it is about hollowing out public services and in many ways replacing political decision-making with economic decision-making. It's making neoliberalism compulsory, bureaucratic reforms undermining not just the democratic process but also people's financial security. Now, the Minister is well aware the report issued and released 2 days ago by Aviva, revealing the extent of deprivation that exists in this state, with over 1 million adults struggling to make ends meet. And tellingly, actually, 2/3 of those who are struggling seeing no prospect of an improvement in their personal circumstances. That fact alone actually tells us quite a lot about the damage that's been inflicted. Because even in the dire times of the 1930s and the 1950s and even the 1980s, when people were emigrating, people still had aspirations about improvements being made in their lives. And those aspirations have been largely lost, which I think is an incredible indictment on the existing political establishment, because the generation of today actually face the prospect of being worse off than their parents. Secure full-time jobs are diminishing at an alarming rate, no matter what time you get out of bed at. That's a reality. And I think access to decent education is very much under threat, because the very policies of austerity measures that cut structural investment and enforce a recruitment embargo, with the downgrading of teachers' pay and conditions in 2011. So FEMPI as a programme hasn't made a positive contribution to the Irish economy, not least to the people who were at the butt of it or the receiving end of its policies. It didn't stop inequality. In actual fact, it contributed to a reality which tasks have highlighted, that Ireland is the most unequal society in the EU. And during this time, when jobs that people would have aspired to in years past, the chance of your kids being a teacher or a guard or a nurse, everybody wanted that. Gone. It's an illusion now. It's something, if you're a nurse, that you do your training ground here at the expense of the Irish taxpayer, and then you go and get a job somewhere else, because you're not going to get a decent job in Ireland if you are that. To be a teacher charged with developing our young people, you're being treated like dirt if you're being recruited in the present form. And while all of that austerity was being imposed, the top 1% saw their share of wealth go from just over 10% to 12% in the period of 20 2015 to 2016, monies that could have easily been used to restore what was taken from our public sector workers. But you see, it's an ideological crusade, because in driving down wages, conditions and job security in the public sector, that was then followed in the private sector. And the reality now in an Ireland of today, when a guard who might be linked up with a nurse or whatever and might want to set up house together, you haven't a hope in hell of buying a house in this city, not to mind renting one. Actually, you've an even lesser hope of renting a house here either, because wages simply have not caught up, and that's without looking at insurance costs, without looking at childcare costs and all of the other austerity measures that have been put in place. And what we've had now is labour market flexibility, job insecurity, low direct taxation, stealth charges, privatisation and the growth really of unfettered financial sector, which has actually facilitated the transfer of wealth in the first place. So there are huge structural problems in the Irish economy, but let's be clear about it. The crash and the problems that we've had, that we're so-called paying the price of now, wasn't created by public sector pay, it wasn't created by teachers or nurses or firefighters, but it did give you a new emergency to use to drive in reforms. It's very much negatively impacted on the quality of life of all citizens. The fact that 80,000 people left the country did serious damage to our communities and indeed our public services. And whatever justification you had in 2010, and I didn't believe then that you had any justification, but whatever about trying to convince the public that you had then, that justification is completely done now. And the Act is grossly unfair, entirely inequitable, impacting actually on the weakest sections of low-paid workers, retired people, families with special needs children and those relying on care in the home. And I think it's the targeting of low-paid and middle-income workers in the FEMPI Act that is particularly repulsive as far as I'm concerned, and has been one of the key contributing factors to the growths and deprivation that we've seen and are now an established fact in Irish society. Because by taking money out of the pockets of lower-paid workers, you're effectively taking money out of the local economy and all the rot that sets in on that. I think we need to look at the inequality in terms of spending power. The disposable income that people have has been absolutely shattered by comparison with their gross salary because of the breadth of the economic crash and the austerity policies that followed and the impacts on the state on that. We know, I'm not going to repeat it here at this hour, the average rent prices across Dublin, absolutely astronomical. Someone in an average gross salary of 45,000, which is hardly any or many of our public sector workers are excluded from that, would have to pay over 13,500 in rent per year, over 1/3 of their gross pay. It's sick. It doesn't happen in any other European countries to the same extent as it does here. I think what's particularly offensive also is the cynical increasing of hours to squeeze free labour from public sector workers. That was a very harsh and cruel measure. And it's a little bit ironic that the trade union movement pedalled itself on trying to transform conditions for workers, of developing what we talk about a work-life balance. And the reality is, by squeezing workplace flexibility and so on, it's those with children who are the hardest hit, who have to collect kids, who have to pay extra for childminding, who lose out on the time that they need to spend with their children, adding to greater pressures at home and all the rest of it. Now, obviously, I welcome any measure that puts money back in the pockets of workers, but I have to say the latest rounds of proposals leaves an incredible amount to be desired. And in actual fact, what it's doing, by dangling a tiny carrot of repaying what was stolen to workers in the first place, is a deal to make the robbery of the additional hours of free labour from people, to make that a permanent fixture in their working conditions. So there's definitely no such thing as a free lunch. But the few bob being thrown back here isn't even a free lunch. It's actually an extortionately priced lunch at the expense of workers' conditions and extra free labour. It turns the pension levy, in essence, into a permanent cut that will be gone forever. The average public sector worker will be worse off with a 4% rise in wages behind the projected 4.5% anticipated inflation over the lifetime of this deal. So people are effectively being asked to vote to make themselves worse off. And to me, if I worked in the public service, I tell you, I'd certainly be rejecting this deal and voting accordingly. And I do think that the members need to go back, and the unions need to deliver a lot of a better deal for their members, because by delivering a better deal for their members, they're actually delivering a better deal for society, because society needs healthy public services operated by well-paid, secure, permanent, pensionable employment. It used to be something that was seen as a right that many people had. Even if you weren't great at school, you could leave your job, get a job in a county council, have the hope of maybe getting a council house, having your children going to be educated and be better off than you, and aspire to do better. All those aspirations have been stood on their head there, and undermining the public service is a bedrock of that counter-revolution that has taken place in Irish society, and it is taking place to the detriment of our young public sector workers in the main, on the one hand, and our pensioners on the other. And in that sense, I think it's reprehensible. I hope the deal is rejected. I think it's insulting that people are having their working conditions dictated under the guise of legislation brought in for an emergency. It's to scapegoat people and society. It's unacceptable, particularly now in light of your protestations about how well the economy is doing. And I hope the deal is rejected, and really it should be withdrawn in its entirety and revert and allow unions negotiate their own rates and conditions. So.